Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I've never really talked about this sort of aspect of my life and my work before, so I've kind of made a rough outline and kind of going to be playing it by ear, and I'm hoping that people will just jump in with questions and clarifications and ideas and criticisms and heckles, whenever they feel fit. Just start with a little bit about myself and who I am and where I come from, and then we'll get into it. My name is Jonathan Snipes. I have lived here all my life, basically. I grew up in Riverside, about 80 miles east. I went to UCLA for theater sound design. I am still at UCLA teaching theater sound design now, after a few degrees there. And my background is pretty much entirely in theater. Like all of my schooling and training and on paper, what I'm qualified to do is to be a theater sound designer, is to build sound systems for theaters and play sound effects through them. While I was in theater school, I was making music on my computer sort of as a hobby for fun. And a friend of mine who also lived in LA, who was going to USC, heard the stuff I was doing. He kind of started becoming a successful TV composer. And he said, hey, let's do some stuff together. At the same time, I was scoring UCLA student movies, as people would figure out that, oh, you're a sound designer, but you make music too, right? You want to work on this short film? And time kept going, and projects kept sort of rolling into each other. I was making music on my own in a band, doing theater sound designs and scoring little movies here and there. And then I kind of looked around and I was like, oh, I have a legitimate career scoring movies. And I never intended to, and I never went to music school. And a lot of people worked really hard to get this thing that I sort of have accidentally without really trying to do it. So I guess my point in saying that is that I'm not a great person to talk to about what a path should be, or how you should try to get into doing this. I think a lot of the reason that I got work early on is because I was working with electronics and synthesizers in ways that people weren't very commonly, at least in music conservatories of 10 years ago, scoring movies. And so I was doing something that was kind of out of the ordinary that not very many people wanted, but also not very many people were doing. So I think that's kind of that sort of confluence of things, and saying yes to literally every project that came across my lap sort of meant that I had this career. I still do everything. I still do theater sound design. I teach theater sound design at UCLA, as I said. My projects differ wildly from day to day. Right now, I'm working on an audio-only piece that's designed to be listened to on the line of the subway in LA that'll come out I think in January or early February. I don't remember the exact release date. I'm doing that. I'm doing a sound design on a short film that will contain basically no music, and I have a play that I'm doing in Australia in the beginning of January. I'm also in a band called Clipping. We're on Sub Pop Records. We had an album that came out in October. I think those are all the things I do. That's who I am. If you're here just because of the word film scoring and modular synthesizer, that's kind of why I can talk about this. Just to give you a sense, if you're not familiar, if you're only familiar with clipping or not familiar with anything that I do, I unearthed my latest reel that I've made, which is 5 years old. So I thought I'd show that. It's about 6 minutes of just a sort of variety of clips from films I've scored. And the idea behind this reel, that I only make one when somebody asks for one, which is why I haven't made one in 5 years. But the idea is, I think it's to show as much range as possible. So I'm sort of picking wildly different things. But just to give you sort of a sense of where my mind and my aesthetic is, I will show this. I should say, typically I work on horror movies and violent and upsetting movies full of awful imagery and language and people. So if that is upsetting, I'm very sorry. But I'm not going to change or censor anything.
freaked out, you know. I was like, there's a demon on the other end of my phone. I want nothing to do with this. So I threw my phone across the room and it broke into pieces. And then everything around me just like went into complete chaos. It was just like, almost like an earthquake hit. It's like everything was shaking and dark. My whole body started vibrating. It felt like something was trying to like rip me out of myself, kind of like pull my soul out.
Research everything and the full history and nature of everything you're going to see in the movie on the screen, and then boil it down until you got the universal human and global patterns that make it so real.
White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
You just gotta know how to rock this steezy. Here, let me show you.
Oh.
See? Check out this ladies' man. He wants to sign off on this now, right? Right?
Nice shirt, big boy!
Oh.
So hopefully that gives you a sense of like the sort of variety of things I do. Like I don't really write for orchestras. I write for small ensembles of a few acoustic instruments, or entirely synthesizers, or really sort of heavy sound design stuff. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to talk through kind of how I set up the studio, my studio, to be able to do this stuff really quickly, which is what film scoring demands, right? The obvious, like the impulse when scoring a movie is to do the quickest thing possible, right? The quickest thing is always the answer, and modular synthesizers are not the quickest thing, right? Yet I still want to use them because I like the sound and I like the experience of using them, and I want the scores I'm making to reflect to have that sort of palette available, right? So I think first what I'll do is I'll show you what my studio looks like right now, and then just like talk about why I've set it up this way. I don't know how well everyone can see this. I took these pictures today on my phone, and they're pretty crappy, so I apologize. I'm in a really, really small room. that is pretty comfortable for one, maybe two people, and then beyond that, it gets pretty difficult. It's like a small office that my wife and I live above, and I've done what I can to treat it with curtains, and there's some panels that you can't see that are above this. But I'm almost entirely always working on a computer, so I have sort of a typical, it's that output platform desk that I'm sure everybody has seen. Typical setup with two computers, and then my laptop for notes and whatever emails and things that I'm doing. Main computer running a sequencer, and then a second computer running picture, always. And I like to run picture on a second computer because it used to be for resources, right? That you needed two computers because the same computer couldn't handle your sessions in your video. But at this point, it's for convenience. It's when I'm opening and closing sessions. I want one machine that's still running picture. If I get a new version of picture, I only have to drop it into one place. Things like that. I'll get more into to how I sync with picture. And then this is the modular side of the room, and then this is kind of the more traditional MIDI and vintage synth side of the room with drum machines and a bunch of MIDI synths and some with CV, but the idea is fixed architecture, modular, sort of. And I break those rules all the time, right? Because I have a bunch of semi-modular stuff over there, and I'm constantly saying, well, I want to run this into that, and I'm running cables across the room and doing all kinds of things. I used to, yeah. So this is the modular, which you can see is kind of mostly 5U, and then I have a smattering of Eurorack stuff that changes out quite often. The 5U stuff hasn't really changed in a long time, partially because not a lot of people are making that stuff, and I kind of have what I want, and partially because I built those cabinets, and I'm sorry, I keep touching this so much because I can't hear it, and it's totally in my way, so I'm sort of making horrible noise if anyone's actually watching this stream. But I haven't really touched it, partially because I just filled those cabinets, and I said, I have to be done, and I have to sort of have my limits, and I have a system that I really like and I use all the time. And I would say the majority of my modular use is still in 5U with some Eurorack supplementing. So the way I used to set up the studio, and this is very recently changed, which is only kind of the reason I'll talk about it. Until pretty recently, it used to be hard to, when you got to 16 inputs and outputs, you were kind of at your max, and it was hard to kind of go beyond that without spending a ton of money. So I used to have a bunch of analog patch bays, right, like everyone used to, and everything was running in the same place, and I was constantly patching sort of things in and out of my 16 I/O channels. I also had, I got really into the idea of generating CV as audio in the computer pretty early on. I used to use the Korg Volta software, and I switched to Expert Sleepers. And I used to do it with, where are you? I discovered that the Lynx Aurora 8 was DC coupled, and so I used to use that to generate all of my CVs. Like my 8 channels from my main interface were there to generate whatever audio I needed, and I reserved these 8 outputs on this Lynx Aurora to generate CV. I should say, I have no idea what, if I'm saying stuff that is too stupid or too advanced, so please just stop me if either of those things are ever the case, right? If I'm saying things that make no sense, please stop me, because it might be something that is common knowledge that you don't know, or it might be something that I've totally made up. So please just stop me at any point. That's something that doesn't make sense, or you're like, we know, we get it, move on. So I used to be constantly sort of juggling, where my CV sources could come from, how many channels I had available. I was in constant fear of just sending, blasting a spring reverb with raw CV out of a, that was supposed to be controlling a synthesizer voice. And all the while I knew I was looking for a system to get a lot more channels in my studio. I'm a huge fan of, oh, that's a good picture, of this company Metric Halo. that make audio interfaces, and I've been like pretty adamant about supporting them for a long time. I've had their interfaces for a really long time. This is the kind of main audio interface in my world, which is basically invisible in this photo, but it's their kind of higher end interface, the ULN8. This says LAO because it started that way, and I added preamps. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But they had teased for years and years and years and years that they were going to come out with an upgrade for all of their existing boxes that allowed for interbox Ethernet connectivity, that allowed your computer to treat a giant network of metric halo boxes as one big interface, which is pretty similar to like the way that like Dante works or AVB or any of these like sort of digital audio technologies. And I, because I love metric halo, thought, well, it's a proprietary system, but in a studio I don't really care, right? I'm not like looking for compatibility. Like in a theater or something, I would use Dante, but in my own studio, I can use whatever I want because I don't have to play with anybody else, really, right? It's just me. So I got to the point where I was like really on the edge of selling all my metric halos off because I thought they were never going to actually make this thing, and then they announced it. So there was this like really glorious period when everyone thought it was just vaporware, and all of these old interfaces were like dirt cheap on eBay. So I bought a ton of them. So when they actually announced this thing, I was able to connect all my boxes together. There's one of them down here, and I eliminated all of the analog patch bays in my studio, and I don't actually know how many channels of connectivity I have now. It's like 60-something scattered around. And everything is now just output of synth or effects unit right into a unit, like right into the computer with not very much copper in between. It improved the sound of things amazingly, and it's finally like enabled me to work with the studio really fluidly and really quickly in the way that I kind of always wanted. It's not cheap to get a ton of channels like that, but it seemed to be like essential to me to be able to work with the modular, like the gear that I wanted to really quickly in order to make film scores. This little guy in my modular is a custom thing that I put together with a custom panel and clearly a bunch of holes for LEDs that I've never figured out how to wire because they're empty. But it's basically just a breakout for the Expert Sleepers ES3 module because I wanted a ton of CV available all the time. I knew how I was going to use the modular like most of the time, and so I took the Expert Sleepers and coupled it with the idea of like a normalization system, like some wiring behind the scenes. So all of my oscillators, which is this little bank of things up here, all of my oscillators here are normaled to like CV output 1 from my computer through this little module, which I pulled out here, which I got a bunch of. I bought from Suit and Tie Guy a bunch of his active multiple circuit board only, because I didn't need the panel or the jacks or anything, and I wired them in such a way that not only is it normaled, but it's an active multiple normaling across the system. So I have no CV droopage anywhere, like when I'm controlling oscillators with CV pitch from the computer, which is great. Like I can stack as many as I want, no fluctuation, no drooping. It's really cool. It's really fast. And all of that is running to one of these metric halo boxes, which is in the bottom of the modular rack. You can kind of barely see it down there. So each one of these boxes, right, is eight analog inputs, 8 analog outputs, and then a bunch of digital I/O as well. And this one has ADAT in and out and SPDIF in and out. So the ADAT output I've connected to the ES3 that's plugged into the back of this thing that's literally just lying on its side in the back of this rack here, which is maybe not the best, but the rack is bolted to the wall, so I'm not too concerned. And then the SPDIF I've run to the ES40. Oh, and there's a lot of cat hair on that. That's great. Run into the ES40 to give myself just a few more sort of additional outputs. I did go through a period of time where I was using just 2 of the AES outputs on my main interface, converting them to SPDIF and driving some ridiculous number of channels of CV with the ES40 like muxed together. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the way that is supposed to work from his gear. It's really brilliant. I can't say enough good things about the Expert Sleepers product, and I can't say enough bad things about the Expert Sleepers documentation. His things are, like, the things that he makes are incredible, and he provides you with basically no knowledge of how to use them. So it's just like, every time I get a new thing of his, it's like digging through forum posts of other people trying to figure it out and how to trying to combine these signals in the right way in the computer to get them here. I was doing the whole, I was loading like all of his plugins into Bidgewal to combine them together inside of Logic, which was just like, it's like every time you hit stop, it just sends a bunch of random CV garbage to everything. And it was amazing because I'd like really like maximized the economy of channels, right? But it was just always felt like a kludge. So having now dedicated output channels from the new Metric Halo device for each possible CV and gate channel that I want is pretty great. And then I kept this guy around just basically to run clock signals. This gate, I think these are hooked up to, like sort of by default in my template, which I'll open in a second, hooked up to MIDI notes, and then the last 2 outputs are like a clock and a start-stop pulse that I use to drive the timing of the whole studio. So I have this one clock output, which did sync basically, right? It's like a 24 pulse per quarter note and a start-stop on and off, which in my case now, pretty recently, is driving a Pamela's new workout, which has become my like main clocking device for everything. I used to use an interclock, one of the interclock boxes. I don't know if that company actually exists anymore, if they're still doing stuff. But they had a way of getting non-DC coupled just audio out of any interface and turning it into like phase locked, like super accurate DIN sync. And I don't quite know why I switched. I think I was just curious to see if the Expert Sleepers clocking stuff worked as well, since I already had that system going. And it just felt like another box in my studio that maybe I could eliminate. But that stuff worked pretty well, the interclock thing. It doesn't feel like it's supported anymore either, which is always a good reason to get rid of something that relies on software to me. But so I used to use that. Now I use this. And what I like about the Pamela's new workout is that it can sync, it can slave, or it can run in standalone mode. So this DIN sync out here is a cable that wraps around to the other side of my studio where it controls all of these drum machines, where it like provides sync to all of these drum machines and anything else in this rack that requires sync, which I think is just, I have a Korg wave station in there. I think that's the only other thing that needs MIDI sync that I have. Which is pretty cool, which works out nicely, because that means in the rare event that I do want to use my studio without the computer, at least without the computer acting as a clock, right? I can just hit a button and still have the 808 sync to the modular and like do all the things I want. It's very fast, right? It's very, very, very quick. Just a shot of some more Eurorack stuff. I have one little lone row of frac rack still, because I had the Borg and the noise ring, and I got one of the Maleko Borg filters because I thought, well, I should just switch over. I don't need this whole other format. And I listened to them side by side and thought, this is doing things that's not doing, and I just want to keep it. So I love hanging on to that, and I do use that stuff all the time because it sounds so good. The top here, this is that company ADAC makes this 1/4" to 1/8" patch bay. It could be anything. I used to have an empty rack panel with a bunch of holes punched in it with jacks wired it, but this is a more robust. Then this is just, there are connections on the back here to, like these go directly to the inputs 1 through 8 on that Metric Halo, and the other side are outputs 1 through 8. And those are dedicated. In all of my templates, those are named modular 1 through 8. So I can always just plug something in and unmute a track in Logic or Reaper or Pro Tools or whatever I'm using, and it's ready to go. Spent a lot of energy like trying to make things as immediate as possible here. And I love this patch bay too because these are normal together, right? So I can easily plug a Eurorack thing in here or plug a 5U cable in there. I think he really intends it to be like a format converter, but it does have these plugs in the back. So so it suited my needs really nicely. I actually had to have him make a custom panel for it so that I could mount it upside down with the 1/4-inch jacks on the top, because that's where I put my 5U stuff, and I was annoyed that it wasn't reversible. And so, yeah, like dumb aesthetic things. I mean, like so many dumb aesthetic choices that you make when you realize that. I mean, like the visual aesthetics do matter in a studio to me. Like if something's ugly, I'm just not going to reach for it. Or if like something's not labeled properly or it's not set up in the right way, if I have to exert any brain power about like, oh, but that says 3, but it's actually 5, and that number's upside down. But I know what, which is why I've like printed out these labels and stuck them on there. Like I just want to know what everything is immediately, which is I think why I love the 5U stuff so much inherently, because usually, like as a general rule, like 5U modules are named things like oscillator, and Eurorack modules are named things like Zorlon cannon or something. I don't know. I don't mean to pick on it. That's actually a great module, but that's not entirely fair. I do also have this guy over here is the neural agonizer, so I shouldn't really talk too much shit about Eurorack because I do have one. That is a knob labeled trauma. I mean, come on. It sounds great. So yeah, that's that. On the other side of my studio, where I have more fixed gear stuff and a handful of old vintage things that I got at incredible deals years ago. We were just having this conversation before this started, and I was like, I think vintage gear is done. Like I can't, it's not worth it. It's not worth the money anymore. But you know, 10, 12 years ago, I bought that Prophet for like $1,000, and that was worth it, and very much worth it. And but there's no way I would ever be in the market for it now. This one, the Prophet, I actually had MIDI'd so that I could use it more easily. But like this old MS-20 and the SEM, this is one of the newer ones. I mean, newer as in what, like 15 years old now or something. But those don't have MIDI, and I don't want them to have MIDI. I think the only reason to put MIDI on an old synth is if it's polyphonic, right? Like I think otherwise you're better off generating CV. And if I could just have 6 pairs of CV and gate inputs on the back of that, I would probably do that instead. That would be kind of cool. But or 5, I guess it would be. But so hidden behind one of these racks, I actually forget exactly where it is. It's this one or the next one. I have another Expert Sleepers ES3 hanging out, connected with ADAT to yet another Metric Halo card. You can see there's one there, and there's like two more over here. So all of these guys and the all of the rest of this stuff. There's like an SH-101, and that's an ARP Odyssey. Like all of that stuff has CV connected directly from the computer at all times with a dedicated audio input to it. It's really the only point I'm trying to make. I love this thing. I don't know why nobody makes these anymore. This is a JL Cooper Synapse. It's a MIDI patch bay. It's like 16 in, 20 out, I think, or the other way around. Yeah, no, 16 in, 20 out, and it's got all kinds of like filtering and merging functions inside of it. It's kind of overkill. The idea was like, oh, what if I want the MIDI out from the Prophet to control the 909 for some reason? I can just like punch a couple buttons there and it just works. It's a little bit overkill because like practically I almost never do that, and I'm basically just using it as a merger to merge my audio synchronous MIDI clock that I'm generating from the CV source with like MIDI note streams from the Unitor, so I can like play a note on the wave station and have the clock be sample accurate. If that makes sense. It's It's a great box though. Somebody should make that again, I think. It took me a long time to find one. Still using the eMagic Unitor 8 because it works, and I've yet to see any kind of proof that anything else is more accurate from the MIDI it generates. I did try out that, what is that company, Elysium, is that it? They make those Ethernet boxes, like MIDI to Ethernet. I did try that out for a second, and I wasn't convinced of its timing robustness. Yeah, those guys are connected. The one place I still have an analog patch bay in my studio is for my drum machines, because I want all of the individual outputs available to me all the time, and I'm not going to buy like 24 channels of like, I'm not going to spend like thousands of dollars just so I can make sure that the Lin Kabasa is always on this channel, you know, or something, right? Like that's stupid. So I do have one analog patch bay here, and I got this really cheap Focusrite thing to convert it all to ADAT to try it out. It was like 150 bucks, and it sounds great, and it's got a dedicated compressor on every channel, which is like really trashy sounding on drum machines, and it's pretty cool. I gotta say, I kind of like it, just being able to totally smash like an 808 snare, you know, on this really cheap thing every time you want. Pretty cool. More rack gear. My studio is a total mess, and I considered cleaning it up for these photos and decided that would be false advertising. So I am not doing that. K2000 was my first synth. I modded that one to have a compact flash card to load samples on and off of. I don't use it very much anymore. I used it a lot on this movie, The Nightmare, that I did like 5 years ago, and I haven't really turned it on since then, to be honest. But that Yamaha monstrosity is not actually mine. I'm borrowing it from a composer who bought it to get a particular gig that he did not get, and I made him like a ton of sample banks for it, and he was like, you know, this is going to sit in storage if you want to use it, and it's actually pretty cool. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but it did sort of reacquaint my love of like FM synthesis. It's like, yeah, that's the 816. So it's 8 DX7s in a single rack, which I always thought it's like, I mean, I don't really like the sound of one DX7. Why would I want 8 of them? And then I was like, oh, because you can load the same patch into all 8 and then detune them from the front panel and then pan them. And that has totally changed the way I like dealing with the DX7. Pretty cool, pretty fun. I would never have bought that thing on my own. There's my Rhodes covered in crap. There's all my storage, some of my books. These were all of the miscellaneous gear that I don't think needs to be wired up all the time, that I just want to be able to grab and plug into something. That usually ends up sitting sort of down on a shelf by the Modular and getting plugged into those same things. That's a little XLR patch bay that runs up to the closet in our living room that I've converted into a pretty mediocre but good sounding vocal booth. It's like really hard to be in there for very long, so it's really cramped and terrible, but it works pretty well. We've recorded basically all of the clipping albums there, and it sounds great to me. Yeah, and that is my studio. That is what my studio looks like. Cool. Fascinating. Like riveting. Anything, comments, questions, anything? Cool. That was my studio. Oh yeah, I spent a while. Well, I'll get into it because I'm going to show a cue that uses it for a second. But I did spend a while deciding that I wasn't going to mess around with the expert sleeper stuff anymore, and I was just going to go back to MIDI to CV, and I bought that. Is that company called EDV Technic? Do you know what I'm talking about? They only make MIDI to CV stuff, and they make it's really intense, like a Eurorack module this big that's like all 16 channels broken out with like 3 CVs on each thing. So I got one of those. And it's amazing, but the timing was just not as good. And the tuning was not as good. It's like all the stuff that Expert Sleepers says about controlling your CV with audio is, I think it's true. But I will play you a cue that I made entirely of like 60 tracks of Modular entirely sequenced with that thing. And it does, it sounds fine. It sounds good. Okay, what's next? Templates. So I can open it here just so you can see. I know the text is going to get a little small. So this is what my Metric Halo template looks like. This is their proprietary software. It's all yellow because everything is not plugged in. Can I make this smaller? Yes. I also, my studio machine is an ultra-wide monitor, which has made opening these things on this laptop really, really fun, because the sessions are like twice as wide as the screen resolution I have available to me. Come on. This is why I should have, yes, clicked save to save changes. So Metric Halo has their own software, and this is just to show you how large this template gets when you have, dozens and dozens and dozens of channels. Like here are the 8 channels that are my drum machine inputs from that drum machine patch bay. I also have this template set up to work in 5.1. I almost never end up working in 5.1, but occasionally I need to mix a movie in 5.1, and I kind of have a fake 5.1 set up in my place. So I do have a dedicated sub, and I have places for rear speakers, which are not working right now. And then I use a phantom center. So I do have it set up to be able to mix in 5.1, and the Metric Halo software gives me the ability to like really quickly just like switch through. Well, this doesn't, because this is connected to the wrong thing. But I can say like, oh, I want to use the sub as just the low end of my stereo mix that I'm working on, or I want to use it as my dedicated 0.1 channel, and I can switch between these templates really quickly. Or it's like, oh, I want to work in quad with the sub as the low end, right? But to generate 4 channels as opposed to 4 plus a sub or something, some 4.1 thing. Yeah, it's a really big template. These are all of my, somewhere in here are all of my CV outputs, and I've named them appropriately somewhere. But that's why I'm missing my naming strip. But it's pretty cool. I got us, and like this Metric Halo software allows me to really quickly route things internally. So if I say, oh, actually I want the profit to go straight into the Space Echo or something, I can do that here without having to add a bunch of latency through Logic or Reaper or Pro Tools or something, right? And without having to do any analog patching. It's been pretty, I don't know, I'm liking it so far. The software's still in beta, so it's kind of buggy. So I wouldn't use this in any like mission critical, live environments yet. But I'm loving it in my studio. Plus like talkback management and all kinds of stuff. Big fan of Metric Halo. No Max. So that means, so I'd like to differentiate between like a studio template and like a film template. A lot of composers I work with or know they'll build a template per show, but people will also just build their template that is the thing that they write in, right? And that template keeps sort of evolving, but it just has every single sound that composer might want available to them right in that template. I don't want to do that just because I want to force myself to constantly make new sounds and think of new sounds, right? So this is my template. This is my like Logic template. I'm sort of in the process of switching from Logic to Reaper. Right now I'm pretty much like interchangeably in Logic, Reaper, and Pro Tools, like kind of agnostically as much as possible. If I can get timecode to do what I want it to do in Reaper, I will switch completely. But right now I know Logic really, really well, and I'm really fast at it, so I stay in there. So you can see I have, you have to load all the plugins, right? That was a new feature that they introduced that was really awesome. That slows everything down. I have a bunch of channels set up for every piece of hardware, a MIDI channel and an audio channel. I have a little folder of monosynth control channels for my little monosynths that are controlled by, and everything is like named really, really well. I try to make sure to keep everything like really meticulously organized and named. Like here are the 8 mono inputs from my modular sort of patch bay, and here are my 3 CV gate combos, and then I have 1 channel of LFO. And obviously all of this stuff is really changeable, right? Like it's not like I have to, it's not like if I get to my 3 voices on the modular, I'm done, right? I could switch out the LFO or do anything I want. Typically I don't need more than 3 voices, 3 CV gate pairs going to the modular all at once, right? Because I'm typically also not making whole scores on the modular. Like the modular is doing things in each cue, but it's not the whole sound. Which maybe I'll do something like that one day. So I always start a movie with a totally blank template, and I begin by kind of either I begin with a few days of sound design of like trying to build up the sounds that I want to use in that movie, or I just jump in and start writing a cue and see what sounds happen in that cue, and then that becomes the template. And the movie that I'm going to use as my sort of case study that I'm going to talk about, that's what I did. I didn't really, like often I'll say, oh, this movie is about, I don't know, a disease that's carried by insects. So I want to make the whole thing out of insect sounds. So I enlist the help of Christopher Flieger, who's sitting back there, and all of his insect recordings, and some of my own, and I make like a bunch of sampler instruments out of insects, and I build the whole thing out of that, and I spend like weeks of sound design before I even, write a note of music or do anything or lay anything out. This movie, I didn't do that because it didn't immediately, there wasn't like a concept like that immediately leapt out at me. So this movie, which is not out yet, but I've been allowed to show you little bits of it and things. This movie is called Mope, and it's maybe a funny choice to like use as an example in front of a room full of people I don't know, and I'll, we're gonna have a discussion about that later if you want. So it's a movie about it's based on a true story. It's a dramatization of a true story of a porn actor who murdered his best friend, who was another porn actor, with a samurai sword, and then had a standoff with the cops and was either committed suicide or was forced off of a cliff and died. Also, this happened about 10 years ago, not too far from here. I remember this happening, and so when I was approached with this movie, I was sort of fascinated by the idea of working on that story. And I think the movie is actually great. I think it's a really great movie that like really deftly navigates this sort of razor's edge of the kind of politics that you can have when talking about the porn industry. And there are some really awful things in it, and there's some really awful characters and some awful people in it, and I think the movie actually does a very good job of dealing with those and is like a politically good movie that I'm happy to be associated with. If I'm showing clips and jumping around, that may not be immediately apparent. There might just be like awful things happening suddenly. So I apologize if that happens. I'm going to try to like skirt around things that taken out of context are going to be kind of upsetting or might be triggering or something. But please, we can totally have a conversation about this if you want to. If anything, it's not actual porn, but it's pretty close sometimes, so I apologize. But I think it's a great movie to use as a kind of a case study for this kind of work, because there's actually not very much music in it, only a handful of cues, and it contains like a few different examples of how I work with Modular and also with Max, which I know I haven't touched about at all, and it's in the title of this presentation. And don't worry, I will talk about Max quite a bit in a minute. But I'm first going to my bent on this thing is that people here know more about modulars and Max than they do about film scoring. So I'm going to talk through more film scoring process stuff than I am about how modulars work, because I feel like this is a film scoring with modular synthesizers, not a modular synthesizers for film composers kind of workshop, right? So when I'm first given a movie to work on, I'm given just a Usually I'm given a video file with timecode baked into it. In this case, I was not. This is what I was given. So this is just a movie. This is just a a QuickTime file of the movie with temp score in it. Sometimes people don't use temp scores, but usually those are directors that I've worked with a lot. Like somebody who trusts me and is interested in my opinions before they've had a chance to really like think about what the music is going to be, right? So usually I'm given a movie that's full of temp music, and you'll hear a lot of, does that temp score, has everyone heard that before? It's like just an editor and a director deciding what kind of music they think they want in a scene and just throwing things in to guide the composer in a particular direction. A lot of people hate temp scores. I kind of love them if they're good, because it's the only window into like what a director is thinking, right, or what an editor is thinking. And music is so hard to talk about still, right? And especially like even if we all went to music school and we have a shared vocabulary about how music works, the way that it makes you feel or the way that it like emotionally sort of moves the narrative of a scene around is it's hard to quantify that, right? And so if there's a piece of temp music under a scene, you can at least say, hey, when this chord hits, it makes me feel this way. Is that why you like it? Right? And you actually have a point. You have a point at which you can start a conversation. So Mope might be the best temp score I've ever gotten to in a movie, which is another reason I want to bring it up. So what I'll do is I will throw the whole file, the whole movie I've been given, into Pro Tools, and I know it's probably really hard to see in the back there. I'll throw it in, and usually what happens is they'll split out the music, is what it's usually called. So you'll get a QuickTime file with dialogue and sound effects in the left channel of your stereo audio and temp music in the right channel, which enables you to really easily mute the temp music. I don't know who thought of that or when that started, but that's kind of become the convention. They didn't do that here. They actually gave me splits of all of the stems individually. So you can see there are these 3 tracks in Pro Tools. I have dialogue, music, and sound effects split out for me, which is kind of cool, actually. Because one of the things that I really like, because I also mix and I come from a sound design background, I like to actually kind of secretly mix the movie when I'm giving demos to directors, because so often if you turn in a cue and they can't hear the dialogue, they're gonna be like, they're not gonna like it, and they won't be able to know why. They won't really know why, but they're gonna give you a ton of notes that they wouldn't have given you if they could have just heard the dialogue, right? So if you mix your demos a little better, you get fewer notes, and it's great. So I kind of set this up from the very beginning as my like delivery template in Pro Tools, which is where all my cues will end up. And then when I get to my last day of working on a movie, I already have my delivery set up with all of the cues laid out, and we know they work because I printed all my demos out of them, and we've all heard it, right? So in this case, I have these 3 tracks from the filmmakers, the dialogue, the music, and the sound effects. And then these are all of my tracks to throw. Yeah. Boy, the Avid Video Engine is a piece of trash. It crashes all the time. It breaks everything all the time. Another reason that I run the video on another computer. But I need to use it to print demos. Anyway, whatever. So I have a ton of tracks laid out. Typically, and I'll show you this sort of when I get to a later version of this session with everything filled in. Music editors and mixers like music to be dovetailed, right? So you don't have just one track of all of the music. You have like 2 sets of tracks, and you kind of ping pong back and forth your cues in case they overlap or they crossfade or something. It's just more nicely set out. As you can see, I have 9 tracks, 9 stereo tracks set up for my music A and my music B here, because I will deliver in stems. Then the next thing I'll do, which is really easy when the temp music is split out like this, is I will go through all of the times I see music, which is really easy to do right in the waveform when you have the music split out like this. And I usually sort of zoom in a lot. And then I'll make my cue sheet, which, oh boy, meant to download that. There it is. Great. Sometimes, but if I spot with the director, I've done this beforehand, for sure, because I want them to think that I have watched their movie and I know what music's in it and I have an idea of what I'm going to write. So this is actually like a download from a Google document, which is why it looks like trash. But I'll just go through and I'll keep track of what all the cues are, what the start time is, what the end time is, and what the length of them is, and kind of make a running total of the amount of music I think I'm going to need to write for this. I'll also write down what the temp is. And this is, Shazam has changed my life in terms of dealing with temp scores. It's actually the thing I use Shazam for most of the time, is to figure out what fucking Hans Zimmer cue that is, because it's always him. That's not true. That wasn't. So what this temp score did that I totally loved is it only really used about 3 or 4 pieces of music. Even though the timing of them or the feel of them didn't quite work, it just repeated the same pieces of music over and over and over again, which told me, hey, this is where this theme goes, and these things are related in a way that was really smart and really clever. But it left all of the nuance up to me, right, and all of the timing and all of the nuance. Oh, this might be about to be really damning if we're going back and forth between the temp and my cue. But I don't get myself into trouble. No, I think I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good here. That happens a lot too, though, right? Like if you get so used to the temp, you've forgotten, you've heard it, and you end up writing the temp again. I've done that a couple of times and had to delete a cue and start over because I just made the temp again. Yeah, so this is my cue sheet. I'm going to leave this open. And then what I'll do is I'll make dummy regions in my Pro Tools session for all of the cues. The naming convention, which you probably can't quite see, for music cues is the number of the reel, followed by the letter M, followed by the number that the music cue is, which is kind of archaic because movies don't really need to be in reels anymore because everything's digital. You used to have to split your movie into reels because you could only hold so much film on the reel and you'd splice them together, and there's always that weird there's that dot that shows you the reel is going to end, and then it and everything has to go to black into silence for one frame, and then it can come back, right? So movies were kind of organized in these 20-minute chapters, basically, these 12 to 15 to 18-minute chapters. I like thinking of movies in reels, so even if, I was not given this movie in reels, so I just dramatically, I watch the movie and I decide, oh, this feels like reel 2 or act 2, and so I number my cues that way. So this movie actually doesn't have very many cues in it. You can see it has 23 cues in it, which is actually a shockingly small number of cues for a movie. Usually I'm in the 40s or 50s, depending on what kind of a thing it is. I think probably El Duce has fewer, but David there edited a movie that I will talk about in a little bit because I used a bunch of Macs on it later. Right, so then I will... I use a piece of software. So this is my second computer running video. I use a piece of software called Video Slave, made by a company called Non-Lethal Applications. That all it really does, all it needs to do, it does a ton of other stuff that I don't think is relevant to my uses. All you really need it to do is to hang out on another machine and look for timecode in and sync up the movie that it's hosting, and it does that very, very well. And so for a long time, it was, I think, the only option. It's still really the thing that, it's kind of the only game in town. There was I feel like Figure 53 even made a version of this for a while, like a video player that synced to timecode. I don't remember what it's called. feel like they did. And there was one for PC that I used to use for a while too that didn't work very well. Or you could of course like run a Pro Tools or a Logic session or something on another machine and MIDI slave it. So I ended up making my own split mix of this movie by panning the music right and the dialogue and sound effects left, and loading it and like re-exporting the video and loading it up here on this other machine. So I'm just going to full screen this, and I am using IP MIDI to synchronize these. Oh, and I'm going to throw timecode on because remember this video didn't have timecode. So like the biggest headache, and honestly, because this is not my studio, right? Because I'm like sort of extrapolating and I'm making like this new little tiny studio just to do this demonstration. I spent 3 hours yesterday, like fighting timecode and trying to get these things to sync. There's always a new thing that is the problem. So I use IP MIDI. I don't know if you guys know that particular software. It's a free MIDI driver for OS X that is better than the built-in one to allow you to send MIDI over a network. It just doesn't break. I feel like the built-in one you have to restart all the time, or like it loses connection when you boot up a computer or something. So I like IP MIDI. It shows up just as another MIDI device in your MIDI studio, and anything on the network will see it. There was definitely a time when I pulled up my laptop and I was working in somebody else, and like in another studio, and I was getting MIDI from somewhere else in the building over IP MIDI. It was just like all of a sudden my software synths were playing notes, and like time code started coming in, and I was like, oh, I've got to turn that off. That's yeah, because it's great in like a little closed environment. So I mean, I just have an Ethernet cable run between these two machines. We're not connected to the internet or anything. And if I've done everything right, I should be able to just click and scrub around here, and this number should match this number over here, which it does. Yeah. So then I'll just watch a scene. And I'll turn off the audio from the Pro Tools session, and the split file that I've made allows me to control the temp music and the dialogue independently, right? And so I just have them run to mono channels in this mixer. If you look at my studio setup, you will see that on either side, like this big monitor is where I show my picture usually, and you see these little Monoprice brand studio monitors sitting on top of the much nicer Meyer monitors that I have. These Monoprice monitors are just there to play dialogue for me, because I decided that I didn't like them getting mixed in with the music while I was working, and I liked having, like, taking a cue from the Broadway sound design of the 70s and 80s. I thought we should have a twin system just for the voice. And it's great. It actually is. It's awesome. And it also gives me a little pair of shitty monitors I can test things on if I ever need to. But honestly, I don't ever do that. I know you're supposed to, but I don't. And my mixes are fine. So. It's just a testament to how good those Meyers sound, actually, and how accurate they are, and I've learned to make them translate. I don't feel like I'm checking mixes as much anymore on them. Depends on what I'm mixing. Right. So if I'm playing a scene now, I'll have one fader that is my dialogue and effects. If there was dialogue, you would hear it.
So I just, I chilled on my beach pad at the Keys for a while and just kept laying the pipe.
And then my other fader is the temp score.
He kept telling me I did it so good I should fuck for a living. I knew it was my path. I was born to be seen, so I came to Mecca. And it begins. John Holmes of African descent. I'm gonna have a big trailer and a vacation home.
This temp cue is from the Body Double score. By Pino Donaggio, which was one of my favorite scores, which is another reason I said yes to this movie, because I heard this in there and I was like, who's this guy putting Body Double in a temp score now? And this cue shows up a bunch of times.
You could be on it. Why not? Why not? You could be the Chinese Bruce Lee of porn. Oh, you want to be a star of me?
Anyway. And is this one of them? No. Yeah. So here's the same cue again, right? Which tells me that he thinks these moments are connected, right? The director thinks these moments are connected. So anyway, at this point I was still working in Logic, and I guess I kind of still am, but so I would make myself a Logic session for this cue. I'll try to, I know it's getting late and I'm realizing how, here it is, cool. I've made a bunch of these, so I'll try to step through them really quickly and try to get to the modular stuff and then the Mac stuff. This always happens. My class at UCLA is 4 hours long, which is an eternity, and I always get to the end of it and haven't gotten to any of the things I actually wanted to talk about. So I apologize that that's totally what's going to happen right now. So this is an older version of that template that I showed you before. This is pre-Metric Halo redoing of my whole studio, so it looks totally different, and it would not really work at all if I loaded it into my studio now. Most of the tracks are hidden that have all of the synths on them, which I've decided not to do because it just saves me a step if I want to use something that's already there, and I can hide anything I don't want to use. My default empty session has one marker in it, and all I do is set the start of that marker at bar 5 to the start of the time code that I put in my handy cue sheet, which in this case is this number. And that's not the right number at all. Right, I have to type it. 1:10:57:17. Oh, because I'm changing the marker, not the tempo mark. I'm stupid. That's great. 7:17. This is very annoying. I apologize. Are you kidding me? So Logic has this great feature that if you change the time code of a tempo marker, it doesn't move that tempo marker in your session. It changes the relative time code around that, right? So in my default session, my time code is set to 1, and you can see if I scroll around here, right, we're at the beginning of the movie, right? We're at hour. I don't need to explain time code, what time code is, do I? No, okay, cool. So we're at hour 1, like second 13, frame 14, right, which is where I am here, because I've set bar 5 to start right at hour 1, right, in my default. So before bar 5, and it's hard to see, but I'm skipping around bar by bar. I used to start my sessions at bar 3. Now I start at bar 5 because when you zoom out, it starts to group things into chunks of 4 bars, and I just wanted the start of my session to always be the start of a chunk when I zoomed out. It's like dumb, it's so stupid. But anyway, so if I change this number, right, which is 1 right now, to whatever I said before, 1:10:57:17. You're kidding me. Have they broken the... Oh, I see what I've done. Apologize. They have changed this. There's a recent Logic update. There are now 2 position. That's actually better. I shouldn't be too mad at them. Okay, so now I've said that bar 5 is its empty position, 1:10:57:17, and if I jump around here, we're back in that scene that I said I was, right? And now if I hit play...
Huh? My dick? I'm not taking
Mine's
out
out,
my
man.
dick,
Here's
man.
mine. Huh?
Okay.
Yeah. It's right here. It's the difference between you and me. You and us. Fucking Mope.
So now I'll just watch the scene with the temp, and I'll put in markers whenever I hear something change or whenever I think there should be a change or some sort of development. So like right here, like that hawk feels like a big change to me, and the music doesn't really do anything. So I'm definitely gonna wanna hit that. So I'll scrub back to exactly that frame, and I'll add a marker, and I'll call it hawk. Right, and I'll keep going through the scene, right, until I have all of my markers in. And then that kind of looks like this next session that I made. Nope. I think I skipped one. Right. This one's called markers. Yeah, okay, great. So now I have a session with a bunch of markers along the top. I don't know if anyone can see that. Right, and sometimes there are lines of dialogue I think will stand out, or sometimes they're just like changes in the, changes in something.
Oh, you want to be a star with me?
Look at me, man. I can't be a star.
Sometimes it's changes I want to track. Sometimes I'm just like keeping time for myself by looking at a template, by looking at a timing rate. And then once I've locked these markers in timecode, I can start messing around with the musical timing of what I want the thing to be. This particular cue, I'll open a more complicated one.
Sorry.
I'll open a more complicated one a little bit later. This particular cue, I didn't add any tempo changes or any time signature changes. I decided to keep the whole thing in 4/4. So usually what I do next, and this will depend, this is what I did in this case, is I'll make a software sketch of what I'm thinking the whole thing is, which means I'll just write a cue as quickly as possible using essentially the worst sounds imaginable, just to get the notes right? To get the structure of it, the feeling of it, and the notes right. Here's a version of that cue written so that
I'm not taking
Mine's
out
out,
my
man.
dick,
Here's
man.
mine.
Okay.
Yeah. It's right here. It's the difference between you and me.
there it is.
You and us. Fucking Mope.
So again, that's me. That's the temp. But then I'm doing things where I'm trying to hit changes. So things feel like they're happening on cuts. And you can see here, I've really just written this thing using the default Logic electric piano and a couple of sounds in Zebra. I use Zebra all the time, which is a modular synth of sorts. And I like using Zebra because ultimately, if I don't replace the sound, I can probably tweak it to a point where it's pretty good. So I wrote this whole cue out. I wrote a chord structure. And I just name the regions after the chords I'm playing. I don't have the best ear in the world, and sometimes I like to just use it as sheet music basically and look at a chord structure, and so I remember what I did and I can play the bass line along with it or something without having to go back and say oh, that was a weird change that I didn't predict that I did while I was tired 3 days ago, So this way I kind of am keeping track of what's going on. And it's almost better that these sounds are bad because then I'm going to really want to replace them, right? And I should be listening with the dialogue all the time, right? When I'm
Kicked out
working.
right there. This whole valley is just a giant butthole waiting to be fucked.
It's great, yeah.
You and me. We were meant to meet.
So that moment where you said you and me, this is the first time these two characters, we were really getting to know these two characters. I thought that's where their theme comes in. So I wrote a little piano melody there. Anyway, and at this point, I'm not settled. I don't love that arpeggio that I've written, either of the arpeggios that I've written. I just know that I want synth arpeggios going and following these chord progressions, right? And I've done this as quickly as possible. And I will never, in under normal circumstances, play this for anybody, right? I would never play this for a director. Only in the context of a workshop would anyone ever hear this. So I didn't save a lot of versions of this along the way. So we're going to jump like right to basically almost the final version. So I used my network of CV and stuff to replace a bunch of sounds and to, in this case, I used the Monohm Ansible running Kriya to sequence 4 voices of arpeggios on top of each other that followed that sort of general pattern and that the chords could sort of fit around on top of. So it sounds like this now. I knew I wanted to hint at, like, because the temp is, it's from the 80s, and there's like a particular kind of like when digital synths were new and exciting, right? I wanted to sort of hint back at that, and I really love the way the wave station sounds, and I love those kind of like late 80s, early 90s, like forays into the vector synthesis and things, and so I wanted to keep a bunch of that flavor. So this is actually like, there's a bunch of wave station pads in here that are from my hardware. There's also, boy, somewhere in here, a sampled wave station sound that I made for a different movie. And this is something I do, this is where I'm leading, is that I do a lot of sampling of my own gear. Sometimes to reuse on projects down the line, but sometimes that's how I like maintain a sound for future cues, right? This I particularly I sampled the wave station, like the classic like sort of wave station choir, through the Auto Biscuit to give it like just a little bit more like digital crunch, which is not a thing that I always want to recreate. And there's something actually that you get by like multi-sampling. Like if I played a chord on a wave station through a Biscuit, that chord is summed into the Biscuit, right? If I sample each individual note through the effect, and then play a chord on that sampler instrument, I get the effect. The effect sounds different, right? Because it's not hitting all of the notes sort of in the exact same way. And sometimes that's bad, and sometimes that's cool, right? Sometimes that's interesting. I love using samplers to not as like a cheap way of getting to the same place that you would get if you were a patient person, right? But as like an instrument in and of themselves. Like I love to sample acoustic sources in such a way that they're then playable in a new way in the sampler than they wouldn't be in reality, right? Rather than making a sampler sound like a violin, make a sampler sound like some instrument that seems acoustic, but you don't know what it is, right? Which I do a lot, which is a sort of a different probably conversation to have. So really, most of the modular in here are these 4 tracks of Kriya that are the kind of spine of the piece. There's this sort of main one that kind of acts as the theme. I don't know what's going on in the background there. Is this Latin percussion thing? It is. There's these sort of couple of like kind of harmony, like counterpoint ostinatos that are sort of buried in there. So the thing that Kriya is very, very, very good at doing, like the Monohm stuff is really good at doing this. And this guy. And this just kind of allowed me to kind of essentially jam the whole track together, right? Which is cool. There's this other little guy here. A little thing on the top. You can hear like a cable, like a bad cable in there on the pitch. It's like, that's not the right note. I think I eventually fixed that with editing, but because I reached a point, right, where you reach a point where it's like, well, that patch is gone. And I used to be really concerned about that. Like I used to not really want to use modulars in movies so much because you'd make this beautiful sound, and then you'd need the modular for something else, and you'd take your patch apart, and then you'd get to this other cue, and you're like, oh, I want that sound again. And I just kind of decided I wasn't going to let that hold me back from using modulars and scoring, right? And I decided that was kind of too fine a brush. And like definitely, if I'm writing a cue and I've made this like really cool modular sound, and the director has notes on the cue, there are kind of two kinds of notes. There are either throw it out and start over, in which case it doesn't matter what that patch was, or there's change something so minor it could basically be done with editing, in which case who cares? And like nobody hears like the subtle differences between like, oh, that time it was sampled and that time it was not, or that time like you didn't quite nail it exactly right. Like, so thinking about the modular like really big picture kind of opened up a lot of possibilities for me, right? And saying like, well, actually it doesn't really matter if like I use that oscillator this time and this oscillator this time. I know what kind of sound I'm making, and I can make that kind of sound again, and it'll have sort of the same effect, usually. Right, and there totally have been projects where I make a sound in the first cue and I leave it patched for the duration of that project because I know I want to use it over and over and over again, and I want to get there. This was not one of those, right? So here's this cue. There's also a bunch of Prophet 5 in here, as always, because it is the best. So that's great. Okay, so let's say this cue is done. I'm going to go back to my master session. And I'll just quickly, this is just kind of to give you the steps of a cue, and then we'll look at another one in a second. So now you can maybe see here, I've dropped in that cue I just wrote, I've muted the temp, and I've left the dialogue and the effects going, and then I've written a bunch of volume automation on that cue, right? And this is to mix it against the dialogue.
Stick. That's gonna be on every DVD cover.
But they don't put guys on DVD covers, just girls.
No, they put me on them. LL, you could be on them. You know, why not? Why not? You could.
And I mix the music a little louder than a mixer probably would, because I do want the director to hear it, right? And then, just because I deliver usually 3 files to a director. So here is that cue, how I would deliver it to a director. One is a QuickTime file.
Fuck you, man. Fuck.
With the cue.
All 3, just plug in with my fuck stick. That's gonna be on every.
Right, just the cue mixed like in a short little movie. One is an MP3 of the cue slammed through a limiter, so it's like Spotify and YouTube levels, right? So if they put it on their phone, it's not going to be quiet because the loudness wars are still real a little bit. I mean, I don't go nuts. This is like at -13. And then I'll deliver a wave file of the mix that's significantly quieter, right? With a tiny little, and this is a thing I learned from a TV music editor, with a tiny little bit of dialogue from the movie at the start before the cue begins.
Whoa! That's my cock, man. Whoa! That's my dick, man. Where's yours?
That's a good one. A tiny little bit of dialogue before the cue begins so that you'll always know if you find this file down the line, you know where it was meant to go, right? There's no question about its placement. Even though there's time code baked in the file, you're like Twisted Wave is showing this time code up here, that is the time code of the movie. Like that's the right time code. And if you drag it into Pro Tools, it has that timestamp in it and it'll spot to its exact place. But just in case someone gets fancy and strips all the headers out or doesn't know what they're doing or something, you have this little piece of dialogue right there at the top, and you can always, you know where it's supposed to be. So I'll deliver those 3 files. So like here was my first delivery to the director. It's like 4 different cues done in that way. Cool. Oh, it's 8:40, really? Sometimes it depends. Usually not that much, actually. I find that that's usually, unless you're like really doing like a particular like a pushed like style of things, and you're using like compressors and limiters in like a really like aggressive like creative way, or you're like, I need to filter the whole track for this moment, or like you're doing something fancy. Usually that's like a Band-Aid. If I'm doing that, it's because the mix has gotten out of control, and I don't have time to like really go in and try to fix it. I also am not always mixing my own stuff. This movie I did because the budget was very low. The music. Usually, like not always. Like if there's enough budget, I will hire someone to mix the music, because it's just this added step that I don't necessarily have time or energy for. And if it's somebody that I really trust, there's kind of only one guy that I hire, his name is Steve Kaplan. He's mixed all the clipping records, and I've known him for years and years and years. And I trust his ears sort of certainly more than my own, but basically more than anybody's. And he knows what I'm doing, and we have a relationship. So if I have the money, I always hire him. And I did hire him to do one cue on this movie that I'll get to. Maybe I should just get to it, because we're running out of time, and I haven't even talked about Max yet. Well, I'm going to open. So I'm just going to open the final version of this cue, rather than stepping through all of the sort of pieces of it. So this is like the final sequence of the movie, in which Steve murders Tom with a samurai sword, and there's this it kind of becomes a horror movie for the last sort of moment. It's a 13-minute cue or more. It's a very long cue, and I shouldn't have opened this version of it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And it's huge, and so it's going to take a minute. It's going to take a minute, but this is where, and like, this movie was kind of interesting because the temp score was so prescriptive about where things went. I actually ended up accomplishing a lot of the cues by editing existing things. So like that one that I just played, I think that became like 4 cues just by editing it and mixing the stems differently and moving things around. And actually that version that I played is not the version that's in the movie. I wrote an alternate version that was more like dreamlike and more ambient, and you didn't really hear the arpeggios that much, and that's the one they ended up using for this scene. But that cue is heard in 3 or 4 other places. And that's something also that I've learned to not be scared of. Like when I first started writing movies, I was like, no, I have to write every single note for every single scene. And like it's cheating if you just recycle music over and over again. And it is, but on the other hand, it saves time. It is, but it also, like, there is something really valuable about repetition, right? And a great film score will recycle and reuse themes and remind you, and the music is there sometimes to say, hey, this moment was like that other moment that you saw earlier, and what better way than to reuse a piece of music. I did a movie called Room 237 ages ago that was kind of the thing that got me out of doing just garbage TV movies, and made 4 people on Earth take me slightly seriously and give me some movies that people actually cared about for a second. And I had almost no time to do that movie. So I just kind of watched the rough cut of it, looked at the temp score, wrote down all of the kind of different pieces, the kinds of music in the temp, and I was just like, I'm just going to write these 8 pieces of music and then hope I can edit it to picture. And I did that, and it's a documentary, so it's really forgiving, and it totally worked. And so that's a technique now that I use even on non-documentaries. So that's totally what I did here. Is I wrote that, and then I wrote this monstrosity because it's huge and needed to be really, really, really specific. So you can see already, right, there's a lot more going on here. There's tons and tons and tons of markers, tons of times. Here's the tempo map. There's a bunch of tempo changes, a bunch of weird tempos, which you find yourself using all the time, right? It's to get something to line up. It's it really needs to go from 68.1081 to 68.4553 over 16 bars. It has to do that in order for these 2 hits to line up and to still feel like it's in sort of a rhythm and stuff like that. Time signatures, I'm jumping all over the place, mostly in 4, but a lot of other stuff. That's not right. Wait, which cue is this? I think I've opened the wrong thing. No, I have the time code is just wrong. Well, that's frustrating. Oh, yeah. I have to open an older version because that's the other fun thing about movies is how I'm going to open version 1. As picture changes, you get new video all the time. And if you're being diligent and good, you keep track of that and you make a note in your session of what like version of the video you're using all the time. But if you think the movie's done and you don't ever write any of that down and then you keep getting picture changes, things kind of become a mess. So that's why that master Pro Tools session is great to like just be the sort of final, the buck stops there. And if you drag it in and the time code is wrong, you just scoot it over a little bit and get it all synced up and make sure it's right there. TV really taught me just what a nightmare changes in conforming can be. Where are we here? Are we in a good place? Yes. I am going to skip this scene. All right. So this is the other theme in the movie. This sort of what I like writing what I call hymns for movies that are these kind of more elegiac, like sort of slower, like kind of 4-voice things. I always try to find a place to write one if I can, which is kind of what this is. But you can hear over the top of it, you can hear that little arpeggio from before, right? So I wanted to like, and rather than fire up the synths and try to recreate that, because at that point, this was weeks ago, and at that point I had lost everything, I just sampled it. I just took the audio from before and I cut it up in Redux, which is the sampler that I like to use. I don't know if anyone else uses it, but it's fantastic. The reason I love it is also the reason that it's terrible, in that it stores all of its audio information in RAM as part of the preset for that instrument. So this audio file is stored in the Logic session itself as part of the like preset data for it, which means that you never have to relink it ever. But it also means, well, these aren't so big. Occasionally the sessions are like gigabytes, and I'm duplicating and versioning like things. So, I mean, I think the folder for this cue, because I was like, I wanted to do something. Yeah, the folder for this cue is 14 gigs. So it gets out of control pretty quickly. This is also like a 15-minute cue, so it's quite long. But so like in this sampler, I just took, here, I'm gonna turn off the delays so that it's not awful. But that's a good point too, right? Is that I recorded this dry. I didn't use any hardware delay because I knew I was going to bring it in to other cues later and need to change the tempo. So that's just like a little chunk of that same arpeggio. And then I just sliced it like a breakbeat. Like I just sliced it chromatically note for note. Really? This was working so well 1 second ago. There we go. Yeah, so I just have each note and I just play it chromatically. So you can look at the MIDI for this, right? You can already tell it's just like one chromatic line going up, right? But it's which does mean that I now have to use the filter inside Redux as opposed to like the nice filter in my modular. But again, like, is that too fine a brush to be worrying about? Like, is that a reason to not use the modular at all? Like, I don't really think so, right? I learned a lot too from doing sound design for movies and working in Pro Tools, and and like listening to interviews and talking to other sound designers who will say time and time again, use as much Audio Suite as possible. If you're Pro Tools users, Audio Suite is the way of applying plugins in non-real time, like not actually destructively, but permanently to your audio, right? And just only work in Audio Suite and just assume that the decisions you're making are okay. This idea of like infinitely being able to go back and back and back through versions is maybe nice, but it's like being worried that you're painting yourself into a corner will sometimes like really stifle your creativity. And so like working in film sound design and, you know, just like destructively editing crap as quickly as possible and like applying a ton of effects sort of changed the way I work musically and with the modular too. And I just like kind of work really quickly, and I try to keep really well labeled, but I'm not really concerned about like infinite repeatability. Like if I want to use something, I'll find a way to make it work. Like we can stretch and distort audio in so many interesting ways, right? And like computers sound good too. Like if you're making sound in a computer, like you can make it sound really good. You're using a modular because of the interface as well as the sound, right? Like that you have different ideas when you're touching that. The section that I wanted to get to here, well, there's a bunch of different, so there's a lot of stuff going on in here. You can see there are a ton of tracks, a ton of things. Not a ton of modular in here. So, how conservative should I be about time? I know it's almost 9. I don't know. Okay. People can leave whenever they want, obviously. Yeah. Yeah. Where did I set? There it is. So I wrote this cue really early, even though I knew it was the end of the movie and it would kind of have to sum up a lot of ideas. One of the, when I talk about temp scores, and I'll sometimes talk about like the extra referentiality of cues, right? The idea that like, if you hear a piece of music you've heard before, you're not only just hearing aesthetically what that music sounds like, right? You're hearing every time that music has been used in some other way. And the example I always jokingly give to like my students if I talk about playing music for a director is you can't walk into a meeting with a director and have them say, and then like play you Ride of the Valkyries, and then say, find a piece of music like that, right? Because that's not what they mean. They mean find a piece of music that makes me feel the way I've felt over my entire lifetime of hearing Ride of the Valkyries over and over again. Find a piece of music that makes me think of Apocalypse Now and makes me think of Elmer Fudd and makes me think of like big women with pigtails and, like there's so much baked into that piece of music. I was like, that's a terrible piece of temp music to use unless you just want to use Ride of the Valkyries, right? Because no other piece of music will do that. I realize more and more as I get older and my students get younger, I have to make sure that people know what I'm talking about. Everyone knows what Ride of the Valkyries is, right? Okay, cool. I was in a room the other day, and not a single person in that room had heard of Peter and the Wolf. I was doing a guest teaching a class at Occidental in sound design, and not a single young person knew what Peter and the Wolf was. It's very strange to me. Anyway, so I do have to check. I'm sorry. So I get this movie, and the very first scene in the movie is set to Ride of the Valkyries, right? They have used Ride of the Valkyries as temp. And so I have this conversation with the director and the producer and the editor, and I say, I'll write something, but it's not going to be Ride of the Valkyries. If you like Ride of the Valkyries, you should use Ride of the Valkyries. And they said, what if you did a Wendy Carlos sort of like full modular synthesizer remix of Ride of the Valkyries? And I said, okay, I can do that. Like people have done that. There's like a tradition there too. And I was like, but sure. So simultaneously, like working on that previous cue and working on this cue, that last cue was quick. This cue is very, very long. I was also making a version of Ride of the Valkyries on modular synths. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it because of what I'm going to say next. Right, so I made this whole version of Ride of the Valkyries on modular synths with 3 sopranos, or 2 sopranos and a mezzo, singing the parts. I'll just play a little bit of it. I'll skip ahead just because we're... Anyway, so that goes on and on. And it's a ton of tracks with Modular. I got maybe like, I don't know, 24 measures into like transcribing it line by line from the original score, and thought, if I do this, I will not do anything else in this movie. And so I hired a brilliant orchestrator friend of mine to go through the score and just kind of generate a general MIDI version of it for me that then I could replace the sounds. And I did them in like chunks of like 4 at a time with this was still the MIDI to CV, so I had like 8 voices or something of MIDI to CV, so I could do it maybe in 8 voices at a time. So I would do like, well, I'm going to do like the cellos and the violas and the violins, and I'd make all the sounds and I'd do it, and then I would kind of work my way through all the sections, and I would have to go back and say like, oh, now the French horns aren't sounding right, so I'd have to go and replace those, and kind of go in these cycles and these cycles and these cycles. And it took forever, but as I was working on this longer cue and sort of bits, I thought, hey, I've been doing all this work. Why don't I use bits of Valkyries elsewhere in the score, right? So it doesn't feel like this sort of one-off. And all of those like weird modular synth parts that I was generating, that I was like, oh, that's too much. That's too unlike a violin. And when I stack it with all of these other things, it gets too like clanging and discordant and weird. I was like, why not use those in this, say, in this chase scene? So that's a bunch of tracks of Modular doing that Valkyrie's string thing, which I thought was really cool. Then, as long as it took to generate that Ride of the Valkyries, we get to the end of this movie. Is this the one with the... Yeah, so the very end of this movie, we kind of go through this dream sequence of this imagined phone call when he kind of knows, after he's murdered his friend, he knows he's going to die, and I kind of wrote this really like, kind of, it's like the full like explosion of my kind of hymn feel, which is all, pretty much all prophet stacked. And then when this sort of trailed off, this other piece of music came in the temp. Here's the temp. This kind of like really grand orchestral Hans Zimmer-y feeling. I forget what this actually is. It's like it might be Sunshine or something. I don't remember, but it's like very like filmic, contemporary, and it's the first time in the movie that they did that in the temp score at all, right? Like everything else was like there was like a Dead track in there, and like there was a Devo song, and like it was like odd choices for a contemporary film temp score, which is partially why I was so drawn to the movie, along with the body double cue. It was actually a Tangerine Dream remix of the body double cue that I didn't know about, and like, you know, everything like pointed to these being nerds that I wanted to be friends with. And then we get to the end there, and I'm like, this is different, right? This feels different, and it's sort of the end of his life, right? This confrontation with the police. So I was like, okay, I can write something like that. So I wrote this, and this is still very much a demo, like using string sounds, and I wasn't sure where I was going to go with it, but. Because that's not a muscle I get to flex very much. Like nobody usually asks me to like write that kind of thing. It was really fun, and I loved doing it. And then I said to myself, you know what would make me feel better about Ride of the Valkyries at the beginning of this movie is if it also ended with Wagner. And so I know a lot about opera because my parents were huge opera people, and I've seen them all many times. And I have a mixed relationship with them. But I said it should be more Wagner, and it should be the Liebestod, which is the final aria from Tristan and Isolde, in which Isolde sings about how beautiful her lover looks in death, right? And that felt like really appropriate, and a just nice little button that to me took what was kind of maybe a not very well thought out choice on the part of the music editor putting, you know, or the like editor putting in Ride of the Valkyries at the top, and it's like just wrapped it up nicely to me, being like, hey, it's Wagner is an important theme here. Like we're treating this as grand opera. So I got the band back together to make another Wagner piece. No, don't do that. Please don't do that. Oh God, okay. And so I went through the same process, but this time, so what I did with Ride of the Valkyries at the beginning is I took their edit, and if we open my Valkyries section, I just brought the temp music in, and then I sat with their edit of Valkyries with the score, and I made markers, and I said, okay, their edit, this is bar 41. Then they edit between bar 41 and bar, you know, to find all these places to like recreate their edit, and then I made their edit make musical sense, and then recorded it. What that left me with was like a 3-minute piece of like bits and pieces of Valkyrie and some other score stuff that works really well to picture, but isn't like a piece of music on its own. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do all this work, I want the full Wagner piece. So I did that. So I knew it was only this like 2-minute chunk at the end that I wanted the Liebestod, which is like a 7-minute aria. So I made the whole thing, right? And then edited it down later. In the event that somebody wants to make an album of this thing, then I have it. This is the most, so this one, the other interesting thing to me is I changed setup like 3 times during this movie, which is usually a really bad idea. But it was one of those projects, I spent all of 2018 into 2019 with 3 different features that I was juggling simultaneously that all were in various stages of applying for and then not getting into festivals. So it was like everything would seem really urgent, and then we wouldn't get into something and be like, okay, well, you have months extra. So like their months are passing between some of these cues here. I wrote a lot of music all at once, and then I didn't get into something, and then I kind of revisited, and then like this Liebestod that I made, I was like chasing the Sundance deadline super, super hard because they got into Sundance and didn't think they would because it's a movie about porn actors murdering each other. And it didn't really feel like a Sundance movie to anybody. And it got terrible reviews. I mean, like some of the worst reviews I've ever read of anything I've worked on, and there have been some doozies. But it is coming out like limited soon, and it was interesting actually. All of the user reviews, like all the fan reviews of this movie, were like best thing I saw at Sundance, absolute favorite, and then all of the critical reviews just hated it. Just thought it misunderstood it. I thought, but I really love this movie. So anyway, so here's my Liebestod, and I will play it as I start to open. Oh, I'm gonna different because I didn't write it to picture, so that time code is from the beginning of the movie, from a scene I'm trying really hard not to show you, so I don't get anyone mad at me. So I'll start playing it, and then I'll start opening these folders so you can see exactly how many tracks are in here. The soprano is my good friend Michaela Tobin, who has a noise project called White Boy Scream, but she's a very trained opera singer and had never sung Wagner before, so her voice is just like close mics and some room mics. Here are my woodwinds. Here's my brass. Here are my strings. And then all that's left is some percussion, which I actually kept in software, except some of the harp. But let me see if I can even get it to fit. I'm just gonna solo the strings right now. So that's this chunk of tracks. I learned a lot doing Valkyries, and what I figured out is that even though the MIDI is playing the synths, like I'm not having to actually play all of this stuff by hand, I do have to sit there with the score and like play the filter or play some sort of effect so that it has more of a musical dynamic to it. Because if you just let it, I did passes where I would just kind of let things go and trust it would work out, or I'd like map velocity to the filter opening and closing, because I would assume that the dynamics in the MIDI that Hal Rosenfeld, the orchestrator, had prepared for me would have the proper dynamics attached to the velocity, which it did because he's good at what he does. But it just wouldn't scale right, and it didn't feel human, and it didn't feel right. And so I was even going through and like as I was doubling parts, like sort of humanizing the MIDI a little bit more. And you can see my insane tempo map up here. 8 minutes of this to get it to feel sort of as human as possible. I had to separate out all of the tremolo from the sustains, and I sort of did tremolo with LFOs to get that kind of like, here's just some tremolo. And all of these things sound so weak and cheap and shitty on their own, and then you put it all together, and it. I'll mute Michaela so we can hear the synths. I mean, I was kind of amazed by how it sounds huge, even though each sound in and of itself is like very, very sort of small and thin sounding. And time again, I would get to the end of a section and be like, no, those don't they sounded really good on their own. They sounded really thick and like full on their own, but when you stack them together, it's like diminishing returns. It's kind of like stacking distorted guitars or something. If you're recording, you actually don't want them crazy distorted if you want this big full sound, right? So that's the most layers of modular synthesizer I've ever done on anything. And you know, why? Why would I do this for this movie? Well, it felt like a really conceptual, like dramaturgical idea that to me was just like the linchpin in the whole score. It was like, because otherwise, Ride of the Valkyries feels a little bit like obvious or crass or in a weird way, and so not to talk too much shit about the decision to put it in there in the first place, because it definitely like works in the scene and it's funny and it's amazing and in all the right ways. But I just like, I wanted something else to kind of make that choice make sense, so it didn't feel like a weird sort of isolated needle drop. And to keep it all on the modular rather than use a bunch of software to do it a lot more quickly. I mean, partially it's to get it to sound like that, and partially it's to say that I've done that. And you know, I like, there's not a good reason, right? Like it's kind of like a foolish thing to do, except that it ends up sounding like this, and I don't know, I think it's worth it. It also, I mean, got me acquainted with Wagner in a way that I hadn't really been before, and like I feel like you hear the brilliance of this orchestration. I usually try to tell composers primarily to not think of a synthesizer as an instrument, but to rather think of a synthesizer as a whole orchestra, because what you're really doing when you orchestrate is you're sometimes, right, a thing that you're doing when you orchestrate is you're building like tone colors in the same way that you're shaping a sound when you design one synth sound, right? So when you start stacking them on top of each other, you end up at the point where it's like, shouldn't that just be one good sound as opposed to like 40 shitty sounds, like all on top of each other? Like, you don't really want an orchestra of synths unless you do, I guess. So this is the only time I've really ever done that. I'm usually a sort of less is more sort of approach to synthesizers, I think, as you've seen in the other cues, which are actually like pretty stripped down. I should talk about Max. This is also like, I use the modular in other ways depending on other projects too. Like, this is a very kind of, it feels like very traditional, like using the modular as like a MIDI instrument, basically, is what I'm doing. But there are, I mean, that other cue, you know, I sort of sketched it out and then I sequenced it entirely on the modular and changing the melodies in the process, right? But there are other cues in other films and other projects I've done where I've started entirely on the modular and I write timbrally first and then kind of fit other things around that as I go. It really just depends on what the project wants. The other piece of temp that made me really mad in this movie, right before, yeah, I'll open this monstrous cue back up. So right before Ride of the Valkyries starts in this movie, a piece of temp that was used was, oh, I'm blanking on the name, the famous Ligeti vocal piece that's in 2001. No, the Ligeti vocal piece. It's like clusters of. Yes. So that piece was in this movie a bunch of times, which I also thought like, fuck you. You can't put like one of the greatest pieces of 20th century experimental music in a temp score that you hand to somebody, right? Like, that's such a tall order, and we know it, and it has all these things. Anyway, so. That piece, which, is this still open? No. That piece, which has a lot of like sort of clusters of voices in it, sort of singing like really dense, not really harmonies, right? But like clusters, right? Of pitches that are really close together. They're not chords. I thought of a way to try to do that with a synthesizer. Here, I can. It's this piece. you sort of get the idea. But so I thought, well, it might be fun to do that with synthesizers, right? To have these kind of cluster of synthesizers that has the same sort of idea. And we hear that particular cue. Nope. A few other times, if I can find it, in this movie, as well as these other, this is another piece of temp that was in it, as well as these other kind of atonal things that felt really to me like the rising tensions of these characters, right? That this was building towards something. We open in this sort of in the space of the ligety, this very ungrounded kind of cluster of music. It condenses into Ride of the Valkyries, and then we continue to hear hints of that ligety throughout the temp score until this murder. So sometimes just because I want to, because I know Max really well, but sometimes because I can't think of how else to make a sound, I'll decide in the really early stages of a movie that I want to make a Max patch that is a repeatable sound that I can call on for the movie. And sometimes it's a MIDI synth, and sometimes it's not. In this particular case, it was a MIDI synth. It's not that one. That's another Max patch I want to show in a second. Okay, here it is. I remembered the deep note, which is the THX logo sound. And I remember reading an interview with the guy who's made that, whose name I'm blanking on, but it was built on a custom DSP computer in the early 80s. And essentially, in my recollection, he programmed a bunch of he programmed it in such a way that a bunch of wavetable oscillators would start at random pitches and then over a particular amount of time would condense on a chord, right? So we all know that the THX sounds like, right? It's this huge sort of cluster that moves down to a single chord. So I thought that would be a fun kind of Max synth to make in a way, I couldn't think of something that would really do exactly what I wanted. So I wanted to make a granular sort of synthesizer using wavetable oscillators that could start at a range of random pitches and then slowly condense onto whatever note I was playing over a particular amount of time. So that's what this is, and I don't really I don't know how anyone has the time to customize the way that their Max patches look like if they're going to be using them just themselves. Maybe just other people think more visually than I do, and it's really important, but I use all of the default colors all the time because I don't care. Unless I'm going to show it to somebody, unless I'm going to give a Max patch to a stage manager or something on a piece of theater that I'm working on, and then I'll make it look pretty a little bit. But this, I made it in this shape so that I could control it using Mira on my iPad, which I love doing. I love, love, love Mira. And so I need to not be playing a synth in Logic at the same time. I'm just gonna, no, I don't want to close that session because I want to, there we go. Okay, so this is what it sounds like. This is me playing it. I clearly have a buffer. Oh, I really do. Oh, it's because I have too many things open. But I want them all open because I want to show them all to you. There we go, that's fine. So it sort of does that, right? Sort of doing that. But sort of thinking about the controls that I would use, because I wasn't rendering this in non-real time like the deep note was, right? I was thinking about the controls in real time that I could now play with, right? I opened up kind of a lot of possibilities of a playable synth. And I don't know of anything else that would work exactly like this if I wanted to. So this multi-slider here is the starting random range of the pitch of each oscillator, right? If I set that very, very high, all the oscillators will start high and then drift to the note that I'm playing. And it's also polyphonic. And very CPU intensive. So I can't actually play chords with it. If I change my arrival time to be much shorter, maybe a little faster than that, or a little slower than that. So here's my arrival time multi-slider. I also love the multi-slider object as an interface, or not the multi-slider, the range slider object as an interface for controlling parameters, because to me it's just set up to define the bounds of a random range, so that instead of just a simple knob or like 2 parameters, you're always picking a range in which that parameter can be. So every time you hit a note or every time you do something, it's different slightly. So I can play chords with it, and I could play like melodic material. I'm gonna turn the release down so it's a shorter. And it is a wavetable synth, right? So I can load whatever kind of. I'll widen this again. It does kind of sound THX-y, but you could also have it start low and go high, right? And some of them get there really fast, and then some of them take a while. I feel like it's 16 oscillators per 6 voices is the way I have it set up. I think that's my memory. But then I also discovered that it was kind of interesting if I turn the sustain off on each of the amplitude envelopes on each of the oscillators. It's not going to sound like much until I could get these little kind of clustery gestures, right? And I thought, well, really, I want to be re-triggering those. So I tied like just a square wave like gate signal to the global transport. Oh, and apparently something else in another max patch in the background. Nope. Cool. I had to preload all my max patches before this in case they all broke, because sometimes they do. Or like they can't find the folder that the sounds are in or something, right? So now I'm re-triggering the note on 8th notes just at the clock of 120, and I have a probability and a delay on each of those triggers so that they can be degrees of rhythmic or not. Which gets me these sort of clusters that will eventually condense on a note. It's pretty cool. I like it. Nice little major chord. So I set that up to be able to be controlled with MIDI and just ran it on another machine, and I think took ADAT in or something and multi-tracked a ton of it in a bunch of sections in cues. Right. So that's it. That's that max patch. And all. It was really good at creating these like really low, kind of billowy, clustery things. There's also a filter. There's also a bunch of filter control, and I could play all of the parameters in real time when it's the only thing running on a machine. And then I just recorded it as audio. So a second layer of it is about to come in. That second layer is this. A lot more happens here. So that's all the max patch. And that's the MIDI data I'm sending to it. So you can see it's like pretty gnarly, clustery also. So it's sort of clusters on clusters. And I do that a lot. I'll make just like, this is my max patch for this movie, and I have it running on a machine, and it's an instrument that only exists for that movie, and I never pull it out again, except to show you people right now, I guess. I had a couple more of those up. Oh man, I do really want to talk about this one, because that's a really new one. I made, well, this is less interesting. This is my max patch for a movie I did called Starry Eyes, that mostly ended up getting completely cut from the score because the directors didn't like things that sounded like harsh noise, and it really does. I forgot about it, and I was digging through things. I should probably use it. I'll show you another patch, something I'm working on right now. I'm going to close that one because we're done with it. Wait, where are you? I just saw you. There we go. Okay. You can see how beautiful I make my max patches when I'm the only one who's ever going to see them. And this is a particularly, like, this is a max patch that's for one cue, and I'm probably not going to use it for another cue in this project at all. So I'm working on a movie right now that I won't say too much about because we're still really, really working on it. But the content of the movie made me think that it would be really interesting to really make computer music in a way I don't usually get to in movie scores, and to really think particularly about like deconstructing the spectrum, like the like spectrally deconstructing audio. The movie is about, well, it's a documentary about people who believe that we live in a computer simulation. So I felt like the music should at times kind of get deconstructed in the way that like a cell phone might lose reception, and then reconstruct that spectrum into something else, right? It was kind of the guiding principle I'm using to start to make this stuff. So I started to think about like, just like simple processes that could yield a cue in a kind of like Steve Reich or Alvin Lucier kind of way, where you just like set up a process and let it kind of happen, and and if it's beautiful, then it's a piece of music, and if it's not, then you don't tell anybody, I guess. And I love of course everybody does, but I love Steve Reich's phase music, and I started to think, well, like, what if you didn't phase the whole sound? What if instead of two identical sounds, like sort of drifting out of phase, I assume we're all familiar with Come Out and It's Gonna Rain and the way that phase music works. What if you instead phased each partial in the spectrum, right? So if you have an FFT and you've broken your spectrum into 1024, 2048, or however many bands that you want, then you phase all of those bands until they become a cluster of bands, and then they can come back together. Of course, it would take probably years, decades, for them to actually come back together, because if you're delaying them all at a random amount, right, you'd have to find some number that Anyway, it's totally impractical. But what I realized I was talking about was really a spectral delay, right? It was just like a delay with however many bands across the spectrum that you wanted, and so I made that partially by stealing some patches from some other people on some forums, and just like thinking about the logic in which those worked. So I think the file is loaded that I used for this cue, and the volume is off. Eh? Oh, because I hit the wrong button. Right, okay. So this is just a mono SF play object with one file loaded in it, which is, well, it's this wave file here, which is just a recording of, again, Michaela Tobin, who was the soprano on the thing I just played. I work with the same people over and over again because I like them. And And I thought that would be like a really like simple sound to sort of break apart. So this multi-slider represents the, and again, I stole this from somebody, and I don't remember who it is, and I should give them credit. But this represents the amount of spectral delay that's being applied. So what I decided was that at the start of every version of this, I would generate I forget how many frames it is. These notes are well, it seems like it's 512. That FFT says 512. So I'm going to say it generates a list of 512 numbers that are those 512 delay times. And then in every cycle of the repeating of the note, it just adds that delay to those, those 512 delay times to each time it happens, right? Which I will turn on by clicking this gate here. So I'm going to start the loop again, and then I'll turn on the delays. And you can start to see them creep. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to artificially generate a whole bunch of... And if you keep going, like the further you go, you sort of, I mean, it's like I Am Sitting in a Room or the phase pieces, right, where you lose complete track of what the original sound was. So I wrote a really simple cue around that. I did it 3 times to the same sound with different delay times and panned them left, center, and right, and then just wrote a really simple cue around it. And this is in Reaper, and it's not to picture because it's a documentary, and I'm writing. I'll skip ahead because it's quite long. There's a layer of Rhodes, or a couple layers of Rhodes, and some pads in Zebra that I'll probably replace later. Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Oh, I'm just using MIDI to trigger it. In this case, I'm just using MIDI. So this max patch was not running on my studio machine. It was running on another machine. And I was pulling the audio in from it, actually using the new Metric Halo stuff, because they allow you to just plug a machine via USB into any of those boxes on your chain, and then you have those channels available to you as well, which is... Within my what, sorry? Oh, yeah, I just use MIDI, usually. Although, I will say in theater stuff I've been doing recently, because Reaper is so OSC friendly, I've been sort of pulling the OSC that Reaper spits out naturally and using it to trigger events in Max and QLab and on the lighting console and things like that. Because you can just, that's kind of a I could open it up if you're really interested. Because you can just kind of sniff all of the OSC that Reaper is sending out if you make it a fraudulent control surface and say, this control surface receives OSC, and send everything to it. And then you can just kind of sniff it and use OSC routing to do things based on the events in Reaper, which include, the transport and the timeline and beats and bars and things. So you could absolutely like musically sync based on that. But usually if I'm working on a cue to cue basis, I'll just like set delay times manually, and like I'll set things that would be session dependent manually usually. Yeah, you'll notice I don't use Ableton really at all, which I do use it live now in clipping in the band that I'm in, but I don't really use it for studio stuff, and I especially don't use it for scoring movies because it doesn't do time code at all in any kind of reasonable way, and it also won't export a MIDI file. So if I write a cue in Ableton with a bunch of tempo changes, as you've seen, I can't export a MIDI file to then bring it into like something else to mix it in or like trade it with somebody else. As I like Ableton more and more, because I'm using it for my live work, I'm like scheming on ways to integrate it a little more, whether with Link or just with MIDI or something, so that I could use it more for films. I did a movie recently, a short film. I like doing short films because it allows me to just try an idea that might not be a good way of working, but if it isn't, I've only committed to it for a 10-minute project or something. And I did a movie recently where I just treated Pro Tools as a multi-track tape machine, and I have no tempo information in it at all, and I just played everything live. And anything that was like on a clock or like sequenced by the modular, it was just the clocking was internal to the modular, and I just did it that way. And if I wanted to sync things later, I just had to guess and try, you know, and I had no sync signals and nothing. And it was great. It worked out really well. It was really fun. And I can imagine running Ableton not synced to anything. In fact, I actually just did this on a project that is not out yet, but I just ran it kind of as like a really smart sampler, sort of in the background, not synchronized to anything, just manually triggering it, kind of bringing in loops and textures and sort of tones, just treating it as like a, you know, big bank of sounds that were available to me, like an instant replay or something almost. And that could be really useful in a film scoring environment to kind of improvise cues a little more, right? Which would be pretty cool. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, actually that's a thing that Logic does really, really well. I'm trying to get away from Logic because Apple is slowly breaking it and ruining it for everybody, and I also spent a really long time trying to get these Logic sessions to open on this machine yesterday without downloading all of the factory content and unlinking to my personal sampler library, which it really just doesn't want you to have one of those anymore, I guess, in this newest version of Logic. Very frustrating. Yeah. So, oh boy, what's the best way? So Logic deals with tempo markers in a really interesting way. Maybe I should make... Where's my Mope folder? Nope, that's a different thing. So like, here, I'll open this. This version of this previous cue that just has the markers in it and no... Yeah, you're not there. Okay, so... oh, did I already do this? No, okay, so... I've put in all my markers, right, and I've locked them to timecode in Reaper or in Logic by making them what they call scene markers, right? So which means that if I change the tempo now of this session, if I change the musical information, the timing of these markers isn't going to shift at all, right? So like right now, I've made this marker called Hawk. and I'm going to turn on the metronome so that we hear it. Right now my tempo's at 88, right? And so like 2 bars are going to happen, and then halfway through bar 14, that hawk is going to happen. Hawk, right? And I don't want that, right? What I want is that for that to land on a downbeat, say, right? I'm going to write a piece of music, and it's going to ramp up, and then when that hawk hits, when it's that cut to that hawk, that's a downbeat of a piece of music. And so let's say I want my, let's say I've like done a lot of soul searching about tempo, and I want my tempo to be 95, or something else. Oh, that's too close. I fucking nailed it. That's not okay. 102. Sure. Okay. So my tempo is 102, and you can see as I'm like shifting this, tempo around, if I move the tempo around, right, the markers move against the musical clock, right? But the first one doesn't, and that's because I set my tempo marker to bar 5 at that time code, and there's no tempo marker before it. Right, so that's become the linchpin that is the start of the cue, and I can adjust the tempo around the side of it. This is my favorite thing that Logic does. Pro Tools works in a similar. There's a way to work in Pro Tools in a similar way, but this makes a lot of sense to my brain for whatever reason. So like, let's say my tempo is something outrageous like 124. Well, and let's say. This is not a great example. So let's say I'm getting close here, right? Like let's say 127 is my tempo, and I know I want it to start here, and then I know after however many bars this is, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bars, 3, 4, I want that to be the hawk, right? I can just jump into my marker list, grab that hawk time code, copy it, jump back to my tempo list, make a new tempo change, and say, okay, bar 11, I want that to be the time, this, whatever it is. Wait, where did my hawk go? Oh, was I doing the wrong thing this whole time? Was I showing you the wrong marker? Yes, I was. Apologize. So let's say after bar 18, right, this is bar 17, 18, 2, 3, 4. That's where I want the hawk to come up, right, after bar 18. So I will make a new tempo change at bar 18, and then I will copy and paste the time code that hawk is at, right? And it'll calculate what the previous tempo needs to be to make that happen, which in this case is 122.6338. But now if I go back a few bars, and it's right on bound beat, right? And then you can just I'll go through a whole session that way, just thinking about tempo, just kind of thinking like even before I have any melodic ideas. I mean, I'll have some from the temp, but I'll go through and just think of tempo and just basically write a click track, especially for a long cue. Or like sometimes I know where I'm going, and then halfway through I don't know where I'm going anymore, so I'll write the first half, and then I'll continue on writing the tempo based on what I've just made. And that's a huge part of the reason that I do that software sketch most of the time. Because if I've really locked myself to the modular at a specific tempo at the very beginning, then I'm sort of hamstrung until I just make sure that musically I think the whole thing works and there's like a shape to it and it does stuff that I want it to do timing-wise. Then I'll go back and replace a bunch of sounds. I think I've taken up enough of your time, unless there's anything anything else anybody thinks I can tell them. That's part of it. I mean, honestly, if that was my primary concern, I would be using Ableton, obviously, right? Like, because Ableton and Max work so well together, and I'm really jealous of it. I mean, better than anything else. No, I love using Max for Live, right? And that's a huge part of the reason that I've moved to using Ableton Live. Honestly, most of the reason that I want to move to Reaper is because politically it feels like a good company to support. And I love applications that feel like you can really get in under the hood of them in a particular way. The way that it deals with region exporting and the render matrix in Reaper is like enough for me. Like I've definitely switched in a theater setting. I don't use anything else anymore. Like for asset creation, like any project where I have to like manage a ton of assets or like generate a bunch of field recordings or like do you know, like tag and label a bunch of things and like regenerate a bunch of assets. I did a project for I don't think it's on here anymore. I think nope, it's gone. I did, oh, unless it's on this drive. Nope. I did a project for Sesame Street, just like a sort of grunt work audio editing and sound design project for like a Sesame Street attraction at SeaWorld in Florida. I'm pretty sure it's happened, so I'm not violating any NDAs. Regardless, it just was a ton of asset management because it was basically like a video game that kids would play with, and I had like 90 different takes of Cookie Monster listing different ingredients for the thing he was making. So he'd be like, oh, carrots, I'm looking for carrots, and that's file 1 of 25 of the carrot files. And doing that in Reaper was like, it was like I would get to the end of my editing session, I'd get my notes, and I would like fix all the things, and I'd hit one button, and it would export 150 files, and nothing else will do that. So that's huge for me. I also, maybe not super exciting for like people who use Ableton and Bitwig and things like that, but you can modulate any parameter on any plugin with like an LFO or an envelope follower or something from any other track. You can route tracks to and from each other themselves even if you want. There's only one kind of track in Reaper, which I really like. It's just track, and they can have MIDI and audio data on them. And they can receive audio in real time from other tracks. So if you like want something to be a bus, you just tell another track to send audio to it. It's like really, it feels like some of the first software that has like fully abandoned the idea that we need to be on an analog mixer, like that we're still on analog mixers and tape machines. Yeah, non-destructive reversing. Each clip can have its own stack of audio effects on it that aren't on the track. I could go on and on. There's like all sorts of things that I just don't usually see. Yeah. Oh yeah, timecode sucks. Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah, they need to fix it. Every version that comes out, I just do a quick find for the word timecode in the change notes, and it's never there, and I'm always angry. No, actually, I mean the way that they do timecode is actually really interesting. It's just like it's interesting, but it's like useless. You make a timecode object on a track, so like an item or a clip that is a timecode generator, and you tell it where you want that timecode to start, and then you can just move it around anywhere you want, and you can say, oh, it's LTC, so I'm going to attach it to an audio output, or it's MTC, so I'm going to attach it to a MIDI output, which is cool if you have like 8 devices that you need to synchronize in timecode that are all running different formats at different frame rates. But when does that happen? I mean, I have one thing that I need to synchronize, and I need it to just always work, and to for this number to be this number, right? That's all I need, and it's really, really, really hard to get that set up and to have, like work with it fluidly. There's a bunch of like third-party user extensions that are like getting pretty close to making it work, and I've been playing with it more. But for now, I'm mostly writing in Reaper, not to picture. But all of the clipping material is made in Reaper now at this point. The last album is like probably like a third Reaper, a third Logic, a third Pro Tools, and everything we've made since then is I've started in Reaper as much as possible. Unless it's an idea that I don't like, I know I can accomplish in Logic in a particular way or Pro Tools in a particular way. But.
Use all these different software environments. Do you keep them all in the same folder of the project?
Oh, my Mac stuff is not great file management. That's the place that it all falls apart because I don't know what to call that stuff. My Macs folder is a mess. It's got things from like 15 years ago. And I just like every time I think of a new category, I make a new folder, and then maybe I forget what those words mean, and so I'll open this folder like a year later, and be like, what is systems? What are those? You know, and like, and it's full of stuff. Yeah, so like my Mac's organization is very bad. This ideas folder, it's just a folder called ideas. And wow, this one is called extract movie frame by frame.maxpatch. Like, I don't know what metric modulation calculator.maxpatch, MIDI phone dialer.maxpatch. I don't know what I was doing with these things. Oh, I kind of remember that. I think that was for a play that we were doing where somebody needed to dial a phone really fast and it needed to be really funny, and I wanted to control with MIDI. I don't know. Quad binaural.maxpat? That's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. So I save things here when I like don't know what to do with them. My abstractions are well organized. I have a ton of my own abstractions that I've made. Those I keep pretty well organized. But like project to project, I'm very well organized. So I use an app called Post Haste. Is it by Digital Rebellion? I don't remember who makes it. They make a bunch of other stuff they're pretty cool. It's a cool company. It's an app called Post Haste that all it is, it's free, and it's just like templates of folder structures that you can save in it. And so, is it on this machine? No, it's only on my studio machine. But so I can like open Post Haste and say, I'm doing a film score, and click on the film score button and say where to save it and say where it's called, and it generates all of these folders. So like I have a folder called Assembly, that's where I put that big Pro Tools session. I have a folder called Scraps, that's where I dump everything I don't know what to do with. I have a folder called Sessions, which is where all the individual cue sessions go. I have a folder called Stems, which is where all my final delivery stems go. And then I have a folder for video already set up, right? And so it's the same every time. And if I think of something new, then I just add it to my Post Haste template. Post Haste has been awesome for that. And like I have a different template for like if I'm doing the sound design versus just doing the score versus doing both, doing only the sound design. If am I mixing this movie, I have a different template for all those things. Sorry, you've kept trying to raise your hand in the back. Yeah. Oh yeah, totally. And I'm trying to think. The idea that somebody wants to make albums out of the soundtrack music that I'm making is like relatively new to me, and I'm still trying to kind of get my head around that. And I do try to think forward about those more than I used to. And it's part of the reason that I like writing not to picture some of the time and then editing, because that makes for a better album. And it sometimes it makes for music that doesn't fit the picture as well as you'd like, but sometimes it makes for these really happy accidents, whereas if I was really going through and tweaking all the tempos and making these like Mickey Mouse cues, you'd get something that's like kind of forced or unstuck. Like the reality of film scoring, right, is that if you put any piece of music over any piece of film, people will see synchronicities in it. Like there are things that will line up even if it's totally random, right? And those are not to be discounted. It just means that you're getting more credit than you think you're getting some of the time, right? And you don't actually have to like micro map every moment. And that's something I learn over and over again. But yeah, albums like, there's a cue in this movie that was like a montage cue that's broken in the middle by this long dialogue scene, but it wanted to be like related pieces of music before and after this dialogue scene with then no music on the dialogue scene. I just wrote through it in a trajectory that led me to the second half of the montage, and then when I delivered it, I just cut that part out and muted it and gave it to the director as if it was two pieces of music, knowing that if anybody wants to do an album, then I have this 20 seconds that I'm not going to have to fill later. Like the movie I did, Starry Eyes, that was one of the first ones that like people really wanted an album of. I was like suddenly had to confront all of these like 35-second cues that work really well in the movie and do exactly what I want them to, but nobody wants to listen to a 60-track CD of 30-second cues, you know? I was like, oh, I should have written more for some of these, and I had to go back and like pull up my template and like rewrite bits of them for the album. So I'd like the album is like fairly different than the score in that movie because I really wanted to flesh out the cues. Room 237 album is different with what that's in the movie, but because I wrote Not to Picture and I wrote these songs essentially. And then some cues to picture. Usually I do half and half. Sometimes that generates a lot of music. An album that a movie that I did that that Christopher worked on that nobody saw and nobody liked, as far as I'm aware. But I had a lot of fun working on it. This movie Rebirth. That was a Netflix movie. I wrote. These are all of the pieces of music I generated for that movie. So it's 48 files in here. Because I generated a ton of music not to picture, and then when we got to the stage of actually like marrying the music to picture, the director was like, I don't know, these things aren't working. Oh, we recorded it at Sammer's place. It was he was like, I want an all drum score, an all percussion score. I was like, great, let's put 4 drummers in a room together, and I'm going to write all these like big drum cues, mostly ripping off my friends who used to be in a band called Foot Village. And so we did that, and I thought it sounded great, you know. So I have like 30 minutes of that stuff. And then the director's like, I just don't really want to hear like drums. I want like percussion, but not really drums. And so I had to write all this additional music using other things. So there is always that, like getting started early sometimes means that you get stuck rewriting everything. But sometimes not. I don't know. I'm getting better at guessing, like at the beginning of what's going to be useful later. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely learned that there are some like when you have the instinct that you're not the right person for a project, you're probably right, and you should probably say no. And I've been stuck in some projects that like I could then get fired from because I wasn't the right person to do it, or that I should have been fired from, but I'm stuck and I have to see it through, and I have no idea what this person wants or needs or means or what their movie's about. Like I think it's about something very, very clear, and I know what it's about, and we clearly totally disagree. So which really doesn't mean that they're wrong. It means that maybe we're both wrong, but really means that I'm wrong, right? And so then I'm just like writing music that I'm like, maybe this is what they think their movie needs. And sometimes that can be great. Like I think the Starry Eyes guys and I fundamentally disagreed about what that movie was about, actually, like in our conversations. But I just made my music, to me, tell the story that I thought the movie was, and they gave me a lot of notes on that one. We like really meticulously touched every beat of that, which I think is why it's such a great, like why the score works so well and why it came across. They're very meticulous and they're very smart people. I thought they were making a different movie than they thought they were making. And I think that actually became a really interesting conversation between the score and their movie in that film as well. Sometimes that doesn't work out. You know, and a director might have a very different idea about what they think the movie is because they've been with it so long. When I get thrown in at the last minute and I get shown something with a temp score that's done, I don't know what they were going for in a particular scene, you know? So, like, I'm going to have a totally different reaction to it. Those are my favorite people to work with. They're directors who know what they've made, who know what they are making at that moment, not what they wish they were making at the beginning of the project. That's a really rare person to find, and I'm guilty of that myself, too. You know, it's like, oh, I really wanted this cue to feel like this in this way, and I'm just not nailing it. So it's like, well, what is it doing? Let's just make it do that more, you know? Yeah? Cool. We good? Awesome. Thank you.